When you picture a Viking, chances are you imagine a wild-eyed warrior charging off a long ship, axe in one hand, shield in the other, ready to burn a village to the ground. That's the image popular culture has sold us, half-naked marauders with horned helmets and no mercy. But here's the fun twist. Horned helmets? Total myth. An endless rating? Only a small fraction of their lives. The truth is, if you had wandered into Viking Scandinavia 1,000 years ago, you wouldn't have stumbled into a non-stop action movie. You probably would have seen something a lot quieter, even cozy. Children playing by the fire, farmers tending to goats and sheep, women weaving intricate patterns into fabric, and maybe a family gathered in a smoky longhouse sharing a bowl of stew. Yes, the Vikings fought, but they also laughed, loved, created, and lived lives that were surprisingly gentle. And that's the side of them you almost never hear about. Hey traveler, welcome to tonight's deep dive. We're setting aside the gore and glory for something more human. So go ahead, get comfortable, adjust your pillows, wrap yourself in a blanket, maybe sip something warm if you've got it. Tonight you're going to meet the Vikings not as terrifying raiders, but as neighbors, parents, and poets. Think of it as sailing with them, not to war, but home, into the heart of their culture and the softer side of life on the Scandinavian seas and fields. And it's not a small story either, because when you really start looking, the gentle side of Viking life was everywhere. These were people who adored storytelling, who believed deeply in family and community, who wrote poetry that could melt your heart, and who farmed and fished to survive in harsh lands. They were as human as we are, sometimes fierce, yes, but also thoughtful, tender, and full of contradictions, which makes them way more interesting than just the action movie version. Here's how our journey tonight will flow. First, we'll look at the people and culture of the Vikings, exploring how their traditions, families, religion, and daily routines show a softer side. We'll see how they weren't just fighters, but also farmers, craftsmen, traders, and parents, each role essential to survival. From there, we'll drift into the landscapes that shaped them, the geography and nature of Scandinavia. Because when you live in a land of fjords, icy seas, and endless forests, you can't just conquer, you have to care, adapt, and cooperate with nature. After that, we'll step into their history. Of course, we'll touch on the famous raids and explorations, but we'll also look at how the Vikings built lasting communities, established trade routes, and created settlements that became the foundations of entire cities. Their history is a lot more than raids. It's a story of building as much as destroying. We'll divide that history into two chapters: their early rise and expansion, and then the later period, as their culture transformed and intertwined with the rest of Europe. Finally, we'll arrive at the present day, where modern Scandinavia, places like Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Iceland, still carries echoes of Viking life, not just in museums or sagas, but in cultural values like equality, community spirit, and a love of nature. Believe it or not, the Vikings' gentler side has survived far longer than their violent reputation. Now, to give you a taste, let's imagine life inside a Viking home. You enter a longhouse, its walls made of wood and turf, the air thick with the smell of smoke from a central hearth. The fire isn't just for cooking, it's the heart of the family, a place to gather. Around it, children play with carved wooden toys, women spin wool into thread, and men repair tools for the next day's work. Outside, livestock huddle in pens, and someone is probably checking the fishing nets for the morning catch. This is what Viking life looked like most of the time. No horned helmets, no non-stop battles, just ordinary people working hard and finding joy in the small things. And yet, that's what makes their story so fascinating. Because the same people who could cradle a child to sleep with a lullaby could also step into a longship and cross the stormiest seas. They lived in extremes, fierce warriors on the outside, but inside their homes, surprisingly gentle souls. That balance between ferocity and tenderness is what we're going to explore tonight. So, as we begin, keep this in mind. The Viking world wasn't black and white. It wasn't just raiders or just farmers. It was both. They were as complicated as we are, with soft sides and hard edges, and tonight we'll finally give their gentle side the spotlight it deserves. All right, traveler, the fire is crackling, the sea is calm outside, and the longhouse is warm. Pull that blanket tighter, and let's sail into the people and culture of the Vikings together. If you really want to understand the Vikings beyond the battlefields, you have to step into their homes and communities. Because while raiding made the headlines of history, it was only a small slice of life. The average Viking spent far more time farming, cooking, raising children, or telling stories than he ever did swinging a sword. And when you start peeling back those layers, what emerges is a culture that valued connection, artistry, and resilience as much as ferocity. Let's start with family life, the true heartbeat of Viking culture. For all the chaos they brought abroad, at home, Vikings were deeply committed to kinship. Family wasn't just a personal bond, it was survival. In a harsh land with long winters and short growing seasons, everyone had to contribute. Men often took on farming, fishing, or trading, but that didn't make women invisible. Far from it. Women in Viking society had rights that shocked many of their European neighbors at the time. They could own land, inherit property, and even divorce if their husbands mistreated them. That's a gentle kind of strength in itself, the recognition that women held equal importance in the survival of the household. And when men did leave for long trading voyages or raids, it was often the women who kept everything running, tending crops, managing livestock, handling finances. Some scholars even argue that Viking women were the backbone of their society. Children, too, were cherished. Unlike the stereotype of a brutal warrior culture where weakness wasn't tolerated, Viking families doted on their kids. Archaeologists have uncovered carved toys, miniature ships, animals, dolls, that show how parents entertained their children. Kids were also taught skills from an early age. Boys learned farming, fishing, and sometimes fighting, while girls were trained in weaving, cooking, and managing the home. But there wasn't always a sharp divide. Many girls learned to sail or herd animals, and boys could weave or cook. The point was practicality. Everyone needed to know enough to contribute. And then there were the gatherings. If you picture Viking life as grim and cold, imagine instead a feast. Longhouses could transform into vibrant social halls where families and neighbors came together. Food would have been simple but hearty. Stews with barley and vegetables, roasted meats when available, fresh bread, cheese, dried fish, mead, fermented honey, flowed freely. These weren't just meals, but moments of joy and storytelling. In a world where entertainment options were slim, stories were gold. Skalds, Viking poets, would recite sagas of gods, heroes, and ancestors. These weren't gentle in the sense of bedtime fairy tales. They often involved violence and betrayal. But the act of gathering, listening, and weaving community through words was itself tender. It was how history was preserved and how people connected to something bigger than themselves. Religion was another core of their culture. And while the myths of Thor and Odin seem harsh, the way religion functioned in Viking life was more about guidance and meaning than fear. They believed in fate, in the weaving of destiny by the Norns, and in a balance between worlds. Their gods weren't perfect. They were flawed, emotional, sometimes even petty, which made them relatable. In many ways, the Viking gods reflected human life itself. Complicated, unpredictable, both kind and cruel. And religion wasn't only about preparing for death, it was also about rituals of life. Weddings, harvest celebrations, even the naming of a child, all were tied into spiritual practices that created cohesion and comfort. Speaking of comfort, let's talk about homes. A Viking longhouse wasn't a palace. It was practical, built to withstand bitter winds and heavy snow. But step inside, and it was surprisingly warm and communal. Families often slept in alcoves built into the walls, close to the central hearth. The hearth was everything: heat, cooking, light. It was also symbolic. The fire was life, passed from generation to generation. And in that smoky glow, families told stories, sang songs, and just lived. These were moments of softness you don't see in the history books. A mother humming a lullaby, a father mending a fishing net while his daughter giggles nearby, a family sharing warmth under furs. For people often portrayed as nothing but brutal, those quiet evenings tell a very different story. Food culture, too, reveals their gentler side. The Vikings weren't feasting on massive turkey legs every day like in movies. More often, they ate simply and sustainably. They grew barley, rye, and oats, turning them into porridge and bread. They fished endlessly since the seas and rivers were abundant. Meat was a treat, not a daily staple. Dairy products, milk, butter, cheese were common, and honey was a prized sweetener. Meals weren't extravagant, but they were communal. Everyone ate together, sharing what they had. In a land where winters could be deadly, sharing food was more than generosity. It was survival, and it reinforced bonds of trust and care. Another surprising aspect of Viking culture is their craftsmanship. You don't spend all your time fighting, you build. And the Vikings were exceptional builders, carvers and weavers. Their ships are legendary, of course, sleek, fast, able to cross seas and rivers with ease. But beyond that, they created intricate jewelry, carved wooden art, and textiles dyed with natural colors. Many of these works weren't made for war, but for beauty. Wearing a brooch with delicate knotwork, carving animals into wood beams, or weaving patterned fabrics. All of it points to an appreciation for artistry and aesthetics. That's not the life of people obsessed only with violence. That's the life of people who wanted their world to feel meaningful and beautiful. It's also important to talk about law and order. Vikings weren't just chaotic marauders. They had a system of governance called the Thing, a kind of assembly where free men gathered to resolve disputes, make laws, and settle conflicts. It wasn't perfect. Slavery existed in Viking society, and women weren't usually given full participation, but it was an early form of democracy. And the very fact that they valued discussion, compromise, and collective decision-making shows another layer of gentleness. Instead of simply fighting everything out, they recognized the need for structure and fairness. Festivals brought yet more warmth to their culture. Seasonal changes were huge in Viking life, so they marked them with celebrations. Yule in winter, marking the return of the sun. Harvest feasts in autumn, midsummer bonfires. These were times of joy, community, and gratitude. Imagine a dark Scandinavian winter, and then a hall suddenly lit with candles, filled with singing, dancing, and laughter. These were the moments that got people through the cold months, the human instinct to celebrate even when life is hard. Of course, not everything about their culture was gentle. Slavery was a harsh reality, and life was physically demanding in ways most of us today can hardly imagine. But even here, nuance matters. Not all enslaved people were treated equally. Some were integrated into households, and in some cases even gained freedom. It doesn't erase the cruelty, but it does show that Viking society was layered, not simply brutal. And perhaps the biggest truth is that gentleness and harshness coexisted constantly. A man could fight on the battlefield and then sing a lullaby to his child. A woman could run a farm with discipline and still weave delicate patterns into fabric. When we picture Vikings only as warriors, we flatten them into stereotypes. But when we look at their daily lives, families huddled in longhouses, communities gathering for feasts, poets reciting sagas, farmers tending sheep, we see the gentler human side that balanced out the ferocity. And that's what makes their culture worth remembering. Because the truth is, Vikings weren't so different from us. They worked, they celebrated, they loved, they dreamed. And maybe, just maybe, if you stepped into a Viking village on an ordinary day, you wouldn't see raiders at all. You'd see neighbors, friends and families doing their best to survive, with gentleness woven into every part of life. That's a 750-word part 2 on people and culture, with the gentle side woven throughout. When you think of the Viking world, it's easy to imagine stormy seas, jagged fjords, and dark forests. And sure, that's all there. But the truth is, nature in Viking lands wasn't just harsh. It was also nurturing, beautiful, and quietly powerful. It shaped who the Vikings were, not just as warriors, but as farmers, sailors, poets, and dreamers. Their relationship with the natural world was complicated, a constant push and pull between struggle and wonder. Start with the geography itself. The Viking homelands, Scandinavia, which today includes Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, are defined by their dramatic landscapes. Norway is a land of towering mountains and deep fjords carved by glaciers. Sweden has endless forests and lakes, dotted with fertile plains in the south. Denmark, with its flatter terrain and rich soil, was better suited for farming. These differences mattered. A farmer in fertile Denmark lived a very different life from a fisherman in rugged Norway. But whether you were in the rocky north or the greener south, you were always close to nature. Cities as we know them didn't really exist. Villages were small, and the wilderness was always right at your doorstep. The fjords of Norway are perhaps the most famous natural feature tied to the Vikings. These narrow, deep inlets of the sea cut into the mountains, creating sheltered harbors and natural highways. For seafaring people, this was a gift. Vikings could sail their longships into fjords, dock safely, and trade or raid with ease. But fjords weren't just practical, they were breathtaking. Imagine standing on a cliff, looking down at a mirror-like stretch of water with snow-capped peaks towering above. The Vikings lived in a postcard, even if they didn't call it that. Their sagas often describe landscapes with reverence because they saw beauty in the land as well as danger. Forests, too, played a huge role. Scandinavia was covered in dense woodlands filled with birch, pine, and oak. These weren't just pretty, they were survival. Wood was the raw material for everything: houses, ships, tools, even fuel for fire. Without forests, there would have been no long ships, no long houses, no warmth in the brutal winters. But forests also carried a kind of mystique. In Norse mythology, Yggdrasil, the great world tree, was the center of the universe. Trees weren't just resources, they were symbols of life itself. It's easy to imagine a Viking walking through the quiet woods, feeling both small and connected to something vast. Then there were the seas. If there's one natural element that defined Viking life, it was water. Scandinavia's jagged coastline meant no one was ever far from the ocean. The sea provided fish, whales, seals, and seabirds. It was also the highway to the wider world, allowing the Vikings to reach as far as North America, North Africa, and Central Asia. But the sea was unpredictable. Storms could sink ships in an instant, and sailors often vanished without a trace. Yet, despite the risks, the Vikings revered the ocean. They didn't just survive it, they embraced it. You can see that reverence in their shipbuilding, which combined practicality with elegance. Longships weren't just tools, they were works of art, with curved prows carved into dragons or serpents as if to honor the seas they sailed. Climate was another constant challenge. Winters in Scandinavia were long, dark, and cold. In the north, the sun might disappear for weeks, leaving only twilight. Summers were short but intense, with nearly endless daylight. This rhythm of extremes shaped everything: farming, food storage, travel. In winter, life slowed down, with people huddled indoors around the hearth. But in summer, everything came alive. Fields had to be plowed and harvested, ships were launched, and festivals marked the turning of the seasons. It's no wonder Norse mythology tied so much importance to cycles of death and rebirth. The land itself lived and died each year. Animals added another dimension to Viking life. Reindeer, elk, and bears roamed the forests. Seals and whales filled the seas. Wolves and foxes prowled the wild. Some animals were feared, others revered, but all played roles in the Viking worldview. The raven, for example, was sacred to Odin, the all-father god, symbolizing wisdom and guidance. Ravens also happened to be practical companions for sailors, who released them at sea to find land. Horses were beloved, not just for transportation, but for status and companionship. Dogs, too, lived alongside Viking families, serving as guards, herders, and friends. Cats were kept for pest control, but also had a touch of the mystical about them. After all, the goddess Freya was said to ride a chariot pulled by cats. For all the violence of Viking raids, their daily interactions with animals were filled with care and symbolism. Natural disasters were another part of the story. Scandinavia sits on rugged land shaped by glaciers and earthquakes, and volcanic eruptions in Iceland occasionally darkened skies and disrupted life. Harsh winters could wipe out entire harvests, leading to famine. Yet even in these disasters, you see the Viking spirit. Instead of breaking under the weight of nature, they adapted. They developed preservation techniques, drying fish, fermenting foods, to survive lean times. They built ships strong enough to handle rough seas. They found ways to live in balance with a land that was both cruel and generous. Geography also influenced how Vikings interacted with the outside world. Scandinavia's location at the edge of Europe made them outsiders looking in. They weren't part of the Roman Empire, nor the Christian kingdoms of medieval Europe. Instead, they carved their own identity, shaped by the cold seas and northern skies. Yet those same seas that isolated them also connected them. From the British Isles to Byzantium, Viking traders brought back silk, spices, and silver, weaving Scandinavia into the broader tapestry of the world. Without the geography of their homeland pushing them outward, the Vikings might never have become explorers at all. There's also a gentleness hidden in the way they viewed their land. Archaeological sites show that Viking farms were organized carefully, with fields, pastures, and homes laid out in harmony with the landscape. They rotated crops, managed livestock, and relied on communal labor. They didn't conquer their environment as much as cooperate with it. And you can feel that gentleness in their poetry, too. The Eddas and sagas don't just talk about battles, they talk about the sea shimmering under the sun, the quiet strength of mountains, the sadness of autumn leaves falling. For all their toughness, the Vikings were deeply aware of the beauty around them. Even their burial practices reveal how tied they were to nature. Some were buried in ships, set afloat on the sea, or placed in the earth as if sailing into the afterlife. Others were cremated, their ashes carried by the wind. These rituals reflect a worldview that saw humans and nature as inseparable. Life, death, and landscape were all part of the same cycle. So yes, Viking life was harsh. The winters were brutal, the seas dangerous, the land demanding, but it was also gentle in its own way. Gentle in the quiet of a snow-covered forest, gentle in the glow of a summer midnight sun, gentle in the way families huddled together against the cold, or farmers coaxed life out of rocky soil. If you look closely, you see a people who didn't just endure their geography and nature, they drew strength, meaning, and beauty from it. Instead of the usual focus on raids and violence, we'll weave in the quieter, more human side. Family, farming, art, storytelling, and the values that often get overshadowed by their reputation. When most people hear Viking history, their minds immediately go to burning villages, long ships gliding across stormy seas, and warriors charging with axes in hand. And yes, that happened. But if we only focus on the raids, we miss about 90% of Viking life and the history that shaped it. The truth is, Vikings were also settlers, traders, poets, farmers, and builders of surprisingly sophisticated communities. Their story isn't just about bloodshed, it's about resilience, exploration, and a surprisingly gentle rhythm of daily life that balanced out the chaos. Let's start at the beginning. Viking society emerged during the late 8th century in Scandinavia, modern-day Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. These were lands of rugged coastlines, dense forests, and long, punishing winters. Survival here required creativity and cooperation. Farming small plots of land, raising livestock, and fishing were not optional. They were life itself. And because food wasn't always plentiful, families lived communally, often under one long roof, sharing warmth, work, and stories. Imagine a longhouse on a dark winter night, smoke curling up from the hearth, children curled under furs, elders telling sagas to pass the time. That's as much Viking life as swinging an axe ever was. The word Viking itself didn't mean a people, it meant an activity. To go Viking was to go raiding, trading, or exploring by sea. But at home, these same men and women were simply farmers, craftsmen, and families. Most Vikings never left their villages, and their lives were defined less by conquest than by community. Early on, their history was tied to their geography. Surrounded by seas and limited farmland, Scandinavians turned outward. The longship made that possible. It wasn't just a weapon of war, it was a bridge. Light, flexible, and shallow enough to navigate both open seas and shallow rivers, the longship allowed Vikings to reach places most Europeans barely imagined. But before we get into their adventures, let's pause on the everyday history, the gentle side. Farming might not sound glamorous, but it was the backbone of Viking society. They grew barley, rye, oats, and wheat in the south, while in harsher northern climates they relied on fishing and herding sheep, goats, and cattle. Women managed households and farms while men were away, which gave Viking women more influence and independence than many of their European counterparts. They could own property, run businesses, and even divorce. This balance between genders wasn't perfect, but it was striking for the era. In a way, it's another glimpse of the gentleness hidden in their society, the recognition that survival required respect for everyone's contributions. Religion also shaped Viking life. Norse mythology is often remembered for its epic battles, Thor smashing giants with his hammer, Odin sacrificing for wisdom. But many of the myths are also deeply poetic and even tender. The story of Balder, the beloved god of light, whose death brings sadness to all beings, reflects a softer side of their worldview. Nature was sacred, sun and moon were deities, trees held cosmic importance, rivers and stones carried spirits. This reverence for the natural world wove gentleness into their daily rituals. When they sacrificed at a sacred grove or poured ale to honor the gods, it wasn't just about fear, it was about gratitude and connection. Now, of course, we can't avoid the raids because they were pivotal in Viking history. The first recorded Viking raid was in 793 CE when Norsemen attacked the monastery at Lindisfarne in England. It shocked Christian Europe. To the monks, these raiders seemed like demons from the sea, cruel and merciless. And yet, to the Vikings themselves, raiding wasn't random violence, it was opportunity. Scandinavian lands were resource poor. Across the seas lay wealthy monasteries, overflowing with gold, silver, and supplies. Taking them was survival, not senseless destruction. And importantly, raids were seasonal. A young farmer might go raiding in the summer and return home to harvest in the fall. The Viking Age wasn't non-stop pillaging. It was part-time warfare mixed with full-time farming. As Viking history unfolded, they became much more than raiders. They were explorers of astonishing reach. From their homelands, they sailed west to Britain, Ireland, and eventually Iceland and Greenland. Around the year 1000, Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, sailed even further, reaching the shores of North America nearly 500 years before Columbus. To stand on a rocky Newfoundland beach and imagine Viking longships appearing on the horizon is to realize how daring they were. And yet their settlements in Greenland and Vinland, North America, weren't fueled purely by conquest. They were about finding new homes, trading partners, and opportunities. These voyages are often romanticized as bold adventures, but they were also gentle in a way, acts of migration, exploration, and hope for something better. Meanwhile, to the east, Swedish Vikings, known as Varangians, followed river systems deep into Russia, trading furs, slaves, and amber with Byzantine and Islamic markets. They didn't just plunder, they founded cities, like Novgorod and Kiev, laying the groundwork for future states. They even served as bodyguards, the Varangian Guard, for Byzantine emperors. It's hard to picture the stereotypical wild Viking standing solemnly in silk robes, protecting the palace of Constantinople, but history is full of those contradictions. Back in Scandinavia, Viking society was evolving. By the 9th and 10th centuries, small chieftaincies were consolidating into larger kingdoms. Leaders like Harald Fairhair in Norway and Gorm the Old in Denmark began centralizing power, creating more stability. This didn't erase the gentleness of village life, though. Archaeological digs at places like Hedeby and Burka reveal bustling trade towns filled not just with weapons, but with jewelry, textiles, and imported goods. Vikings loved ornamentation, brooches, beads, and silver coins. They weren't living in a constant state of war. They valued beauty, art, and craftsmanship as much as survival. One of the biggest shifts in Viking history was the spread of Christianity. Starting in the 9th century, missionaries from Europe worked their way into Scandinavia. At first, Norse people saw Christianity as just another set of gods to add to their pantheon. But over time, political rulers adopted the faith to align themselves with Christian Europe. By the 11th century, most of Scandinavia was officially Christian. This transformation wasn't just about religion, it was about power, diplomacy, and identity. And while it ended the old pagan rituals, it also softened Viking reputation abroad. They became seen less as raiders and more as trade partners and allies. But the gentle side of Viking history is also found in their storytelling. The sagas, written down centuries later in Iceland, preserve a world of heroes, family feuds, and quiet moments. They tell of warriors, yes, but also of farmers struggling with harsh winters, lovers parting at shorelines, and dreamers gazing at the stars. These sagas kept their culture alive long after the Viking Age ended, and they show us that even a society remembered for violence also cherished beauty, wisdom, and love. By the 11th century, the Viking Age was drawing to a close. Raids slowed as European kingdoms fortified themselves and Scandinavian rulers centralized authority. The Norse became less feared marauders and more integrated Europeans. Yet their influence was permanent. They reshaped Britain, Normandy, Russia, and even parts of the Mediterranean. Their descendants would rule England, explore the Atlantic, and spread Norse culture far beyond its icy origins. And through it all, the gentle side persisted. Families still gathered around fires in longhouses. Farmers still plowed fields in summer and mended nets in winter. Women still managed homes, men still carved wood into intricate designs. Children still played with simple toys of bone and wood. It's easy to let the wars and raids dominate the story. But the longer you look at Viking history, the more you see that their lives were not so different from ours. They worked, they dreamed, they loved, and they endured. So, the history of the Vikings is not just about conquest. It's about survival in a harsh landscape, adaptation to change, and the quiet moments that rarely make the headlines. Their story reminds us that behind every fearsome reputation is a human heart, shaped by family, community, and the land itself. When the so-called Viking Age came to an end in the 11th century, the Norse people didn't disappear. They simply changed. Their descendants became kings, traders, farmers, and citizens of growing European states. But the idea of the Viking, the axe-wielding raider with wild hair and no fear of death, refused to fade. Instead, it grew stronger over time, evolving into one of history's most powerful legends. And in that process, much of the gentle, everyday reality of Viking life slipped into the shadows. In the centuries immediately following the Viking Age, European monks and chroniclers wrote the first versions of Viking history. And let's just say, they weren't huge fans. After all, many of them had been on the receiving end of raids. To them, Vikings were terrifying pagans sent by the devil himself to punish the faithful. The word Viking became synonymous with chaos, destruction, and godlessness. If you wanted a bedtime story about unstoppable barbarians, monks in medieval England had you covered. But here's the twist. While Europe remembered them as brutal invaders, Scandinavians themselves kept different memories alive. In Iceland, sagas were written down between the 12th and 14th centuries. These weren't history textbooks in the modern sense, but they captured family feuds, voyages, love stories, and legends that balanced violence with tenderness. In the sagas, we see glimpses of the softer world, the way a farmer cherished his land, the longing of a sailor's wife watching the sea, the bonds between friends sworn as blood brothers. For centuries, these stories circulated in the North, even while much of Europe still painted Vikings as one-dimensional villains. Fast forward to the 19th century, and the Viking legend takes on a brand new life. This was the era of nationalism in Europe. Countries were digging into their pasts, looking for heroic ancestors to rally around. For Scandinavia, who better than the Vikings? Suddenly, the wild raiders were rebranded as noble explorers, brave seafarers, and pioneers of freedom. Romantic painters filled canvases with blonde giants in horned helmets. Yes, those famous helmets that Vikings never actually wore. Opera composers like Richard Wagner immortalized them in sweeping soundscapes where Valkyries soared through the air. Archaeological digs began uncovering ships and treasures, which only fueled the fire. But notice something. Even here, the gentleness was largely ignored. 19th century nationalism didn't want farmers or homemakers, it wanted warriors. The Viking woman stirring porridge for her family didn't make the propaganda posters. The Viking poet reciting love verses didn't fit the bill. What mattered was the myth of the fearless fighter, reshaped for a new era of European pride. That myth, however, didn't stay in Scandinavia. It traveled. In Britain, Viking ancestry became a way for Northerners to distinguish themselves from Southern England. In Germany, the Norse gods were woven into nationalist ideology. Even in America, Scandinavian immigrants embraced the Viking legacy as proof of their pioneering spirit. If their ancestors could sail across the Atlantic in fragile ships, surely they could survive homesteading on the Great Plains. But the Viking image has also had a darker side. In the 20th century, extremist groups twisted Norse symbols, like runes and Odin's imagery, into political propaganda. Instead of celebrating the Vikings as diverse traders and explorers who connected cultures from Baghdad to Newfoundland, these groups tried to claim them as proof of racial superiority. Historians today work hard to push back, reminding us that Viking society was far more multicultural and complex than any modern ideology would like to admit. Meanwhile, popular culture kept reinventing the Viking. By the mid-20th century, children's books showed them as almost cartoonish adventurers. Then came Hollywood films, rows of burly men, always in horned helmets, rowing to thunderous drums. And in the last couple of decades, television and gaming gave us yet another version. Gritty, dramatic, half-accurate portrayals where raiding is central, but the family dramas and everyday struggles sneak back in too. Think of shows like Vikings, or video games like Assassin's Creed Valhalla. They've reintroduced audiences to the world of longhouses, farming, and spiritual ritual, alongside the expected battle scenes. But what about the gentle side, the part of Viking life that rarely gets spotlighted in these retellings? In recent decades, archaeologists and historians have been reframing the conversation. Excavations of burial sites show not only weapons, but combs, jewelry, woven cloth, children's toys, and farming tools. These finds paint a picture of a people deeply invested in beauty, craftsmanship, and family. Linguists studying Old Norse poetry highlight the depth of emotion, love poems, laments, humor that rarely makes it into pop culture. And scholars of gender roles remind us that Viking women had rights and responsibilities far beyond what medieval Europe would allow for centuries afterward. In fact, one of the most striking modern discoveries about Viking life came in 2017, when DNA testing confirmed that a famous Viking warrior burial in Sweden, the so-called Burka warrior, was actually a woman. For over a century, archaeologists had assumed the skeleton was male because it was surrounded by weapons and battle gear, but science revealed otherwise. This forced the academic world to rethink not just gender roles, but the very assumptions we make about the past. And in doing so, it highlighted again how complex and gentle the Viking story can be, less about stereotypes, more about individuals. Today, you can see the Viking legacy everywhere. In Scandinavia, reconstructed longships sail across fjords, while reenactment festivals bring ancient crafts and foods back to life. In places like York, Dublin, and Iceland, Viking heritage is celebrated as part of local identity. Museums across the world display intricate brooches, carved runestones, and ship remains that remind us these people were more than just warriors. And beyond the artifacts, the very languages of Northern Europe still carry Norse echoes. Words like window from Vindauga, Windai, or the days of the week. Tuesday from Tyr, Thursday from Thor, Friday from Frigg, are everyday reminders of their influence. Even in global culture, Vikings continue to fascinate. They're symbols of adventure, independence, and survival against the odds. But slowly, the gentler layers are seeping back into the story. We're starting to hear more about their music, their games, their role as traders who linked continents. And perhaps most importantly, we're starting to understand that the Viking world was full of ordinary people whose lives were not defined by constant violence, but by the same things that define us today: work, family, love, and hope. Which brings us to the present day. The Viking legend is no longer just about raids and conquest. It's about complexity. It's about the paradox of a people who could sack a monastery one year and the next sit quietly by a hearth, telling stories while the snow fell outside. The modern lesson from Viking history might be this: human lives are never one-dimensional. For every act of violence, there was a moment of tenderness. For every voyage of war, there was a voyage of discovery. And for every fearsome warrior, there was someone weaving cloth, milking goats, or cradling a child by the fire. So when we ask, what is the Viking legacy? The answer isn't just in battle axes or ships. It's in the way they remind us that human beings are complicated. We are capable of destruction, but also of creation. We can take, but we can also build. And while the world remembers the thunder of their raids, perhaps it's time we also remember the quiet of their homes. That too is Viking history, the gentle side you never hear about. That's part 5, 1750 words, wrapping the series with the Vikings' modern history, legacy, and cultural reinterpretations, always tying back to the gentle side of their story. So here we are at the end of our journey through the world of the Vikings. We began with the myths and stereotypes, the image of bloodthirsty raiders thundering across the seas, axes raised, long ships slicing through icy waves. And yes, that side existed. There were raids, there were battles, there were moments in history that earned the Vikings their fearsome reputation. But if we've discovered anything tonight, it's that the truth is always richer, softer, and far more human than legend alone. The Vikings were not just destroyers, they were also creators. They left behind sagas that speak of love and loss, carved runes that whisper prayers to the gods, and ships that carried them not only into war, but into new worlds. They were farmers who bent their backs to the soil, traders who sailed for days to exchange goods, and families who laughed, argued, sang songs, and held each other through long winters. They were a people defined as much by their homes and hearts as by their battlefields. Tonight, we trace their culture, their geography, their history, and their legacy. We saw how the cold northern seas shaped their lives, how fjords and forests offered both shelter and challenge. We looked at their gods, Thor, Odin, Freya, and saw how their myths reflected the balance between struggle and beauty, chaos and peace. We followed them into battlefields where empires clashed, but also into quiet longhouses where children played with wooden toys and families gathered around firelight to tell stories. We also saw how their memory changed after the Viking Age ended. To some, they became demons sent by the devil. To others, they became heroic ancestors. Over centuries, they transformed into national symbols, pop culture icons, and even tools of propaganda. And yet, through all the reinvention, the true Viking story never disappeared. Archaeology, literature, and modern research remind us again and again. They were people, complicated and ordinary in ways that connect them to us today. It's comforting to think about, isn't it? That across the gulf of 1,000 years, people are still people. A Viking mother calming her child in the night, a farmer worrying about his crops, a sailor staring at the horizon, wondering what tomorrow will bring. They may have lived in a harsher, colder, more uncertain world, but their hearts weren't so different from ours. Their joys and fears, their hopes and griefs, echo in our own lives. And maybe that's the gentlest lesson of all. History isn't just about kings, battles, and borders. It's about ordinary lives, lived fully, with all their complexity. The Vikings remind us that behind every legend, behind every symbol of strength or violence, there's always a softer truth waiting to be told. So as you drift off tonight, perhaps picture not the raid on Lindisfarne, but a Viking village under the northern sky. Imagine the glow of firelight against the snow, children huddled around a carved game board, a poet quietly reciting verses about love and fate, the steady rhythm of waves rocking a ship in its harbor, the sound of a loom weaving patterns into fabric that will one day be passed down as a family treasure. These small, gentle scenes are as real, as important, and as enduring as any raid or conquest. We've journeyed far tonight, from myths to realities, from storms at sea to the warmth of the hearth, from the battlefield to the bedtime story. And now, as we close, let the Vikings rest in your imagination, not as faceless raiders, but as people who lived, struggled, and dreamed just as we do. People who in their own way sought meaning and beauty in a world that was often as challenging as it was awe-inspiring. So close your eyes, traveler. Let the sagas fade into whispers. Let the northern winds soften into a lullaby. And as you drift deeper into rest, may you carry with you the reminder that even in the harshest times, humanity's gentle side always endures. Sweet dreams and good night.